What do you make of these Trump tariffs?
It's really not working right now, and it's very counterproductive for U.S. growth. Almost every economic analyst is worried about slow growth, even possibly recession in the United States, because these policies are very inflationary.
The Chinese diplomacy during COVID had something called wolf warrior diplomats. What do you make of people like Peter Navarro?
Peter Navarro is an insult to wolf warrior diplomats. Navarro is a fringe economist who is a senior advisor, not even a holder of a cabinet position, who is being allowed to mouth off on things far beyond his brief.
PM Modi and Trump, their personality politics, where does it stand?
The president tried to take credit for the de-escalation of tensions with Pakistan, and India was not willing to give the president credit for something that he did not do, and Pakistan was, plus nominating him for the Nobel. So ego did enter the equation. The president was piqued, and so he retaliated impulsively and more harshly.
China, why haven't they been slapped?
Without going after China on the Russia brief or the Venezuela brief, or frankly that much on the Iran brief, he's not achieving wins for the US. He's just making China great again.
EU has announced that they will get off their dependence on Russian energy, but they've given a timeline. But on the flip side, India is supposed to quit cold turkey.
I think from India's position, it's looking at this and saying, this is really not about Russia. This is really just bullying for trade, and we can't allow ourselves to enter into negotiation, basically under coercion and under duress.
Mr. Goldwyn, thank you for joining us and taking the time to meet us. Before we begin, could you please introduce yourselves to our viewers and to our subscribers who will be getting this video?
Sure. Thank you for having me on the show. I appreciate it. David Goldwyn, I've been a senior energy official in both the U.S. State Department and the Energy Department under President Clinton and then under President Obama. I've been sort of a thought leader and analyst on energy and geopolitics for many years. And edited a couple of books on energy and security. And I've been through the Atlantic Council, through our Global Energy Center, sort of a follower of all things geopolitical. So I've been both an analyst and an advisor to companies for several years. And it's a pleasure to be with you to talk about these very important issues.
Okay, great. David, so let's just dive right into it. What do you make of these Trump tariffs that have hit India to the highest in the world, and the secondary tariffs, which have sort of made it about 50% in general? Is it justified?
I don't think it is justified, and I think it's important for your listeners to understand the context that we're operating in, because this is essentially a bullying tactic by President Trump to extract more trade concessions from India, using the oil weapon, which he thinks would make India particularly vulnerable to, and he's overreached and put at risk really decades of trust building between the United States and India, really to reverse the kind of anti-Americanism which existed in the 1970s, and he's put this all at risk for a transactional short-term gain. But I think it's important for people to understand the economic theory of the case that President Trump is operating under, because it's very different from either Democratic or Republican presidents. So President Trump believes that the way to grow the U.S. economy is to increase exports, to have more industries invest in the United States, and to reduce our dependence and reduce our trade with other countries. Now, for years, the United States believed that an open economy and an open system provided low-cost goods, provided competition for U.S. industries, also attracted investment, and grew prosperity. We also had a geopolitical belief, Republican and Democratic, that by growing the economies of our allies, we would build stronger, democratic, unified coalitions that was not only good for democracy, good for the economy, but also helped us collaborate on transnational issues like proliferation or terrorism or pandemics. And so it was a rising tide that would lift all boats. President Trump doesn't believe that. He believes that trading system created significant distributional losses in parts of the country, and that's true. Our auto industries, our steel industries were really hurt by competition. We used to compensate people who had suffered trade losses, and we lost that. And so The US underwent a period of deindustrialization too. People were angry about it, and that wave of populism put President Trump into power. So his theory then is to raise tariffs, raise barriers, force substitution. Now, the problem is it's a very 19th century view of the way the global economy works. And we can get into the reasons why, but it's really not working right now, and it's very counterproductive for U.S. growth. We're it's been early days now, but the almost every economic analyst is worried about slow growth, even possibly recession in the United States, because these policies are very inflationary. It not only raises the cost of foreign goods, but the U.S. isn't going to be able to build substitutes for this, even if people wanted to invest in our country for several years. So in the interim, you either pay the tariffs, which President Trump likes because it's a significant revenue raiser,
Mm.
or you go without the goods, which is risky for a lot of our industries.
Right.
You hope people will come and invest and build new industries, but they're not doing it yet. And so the cost of everything from steel to autos to chips to food is going up. And nobody except for President Trump and his administration seems to think this is a great idea.
Yeah, and now just going on that premise, David, where does this theory then hold true when it comes to China? Why haven't they been slapped with similar sort of secondary sanctions, as people like to put it? I mean, they are still importing oil in record numbers from Russia. China is also importing Venezuelan oil as well. That did also see sanctions in March of this year. So where does the premise go?
First, I'll say at the outset, it is a deeply hypocritical policy, so there's no question about that. But from President Trump's perspective, he'll get the deal that he can get based on the leverage he has with another country. So this so-called deal, I call it so-called because we're not talking about traditional trade agreements. We're talking about press releases on both sides. But the big deal with the European Union, which called for $750 billion in energy purchase over 3 years, is pretty much impossible to achieve. But President Trump extracted those concessions because Europe cares about cooperation on Ukraine. They care about the overall trade balance. They couldn't risk 30% tariffs. And so they conceded. Japan has a weak government. It's just changed before. It has a deal which both sides seem to disagree on minutes after it was announced. So it's not clear how solid a deal it was. But the president had a lot of leverage, and he believes he has leverage over India. But he realizes he doesn't have a lot of leverage with China. And that's why the tariffs have been delayed, negotiations have been extended, and the president has not enforced, not only has not enforced the sanctions or the tariffs for the importation of Russian crude, but he has imposed them for the importation of Venezuelan crude, and he's not sanctioning the ports and ships and other mechanisms, tools he has at his disposal for fear of upsetting a potential trade deal with China. So this is a question of the president's perception of leverage, and the more leverage he thinks he has, the harder a bargain he drives. What he's learning in this fiasco, really, in terms of diplomatic relations with India, is that this oil weapon was not quite the tool of leverage that he thought it was. India is not as vulnerable, and he both underestimated the potency of that weapon, and he also really misread Indian history. And this is what happens when you fire everybody on your national security staff except for 25 people is, he didn't appreciate India's history of independence, and he mistook that for intransigence. He didn't appreciate how sensitive the agricultural sector is in India, and it's a concession he didn't get from Japan, and he didn't get from Europe either. So this is really a question of perception of leverage, but without going after China on the Russia brief or the Venezuela brief, or frankly that much on the Iran brief,
Right.
he's really having the opposite of his intended effect. He's not achieving wins for the U.S., and he's not creating coalitions to contain China's aggrandizement. He's just making China great again.
How realistic does he really think that such coercive measures with India when it comes to tariffs? If you've seen the political situation, you've seen the pushback from India, you've seen China is also seeing what happened with Japan, with South Korea, how they've also had a lot of criticism domestically to cave in to President Trump. Does he really think that Xi Jinping will cave as well and be forced to make a deal with him?
I don't think that he believes that he can coerce Xi Jinping into a deal, but he does believe that there is a deal to be had.
Mm,
And this is, and there's an upside for, there's an upside in all these, but he believes that he can reach understandings where China will perhaps make significant energy purchases, and will maybe forswear certain kinds of other kinds of transactions, and that he will be able to cut a deal. So it's purely a transactional
yeah.
perspective, but it hasn't gone very well, which is why it's all been delayed. I have to say also, I mean, it's important, Ishaan, to appreciate that, in terms of the trade imbalances, the tariff imbalances, there's truth to this. I mean, there's no question the U.S. is an open economy with, and previously with relatively low tariffs. India
Mm,
has been for quite some time a bit of a closed economy. You
right.
know, its average tariff level of around 17% is about on par with developing countries, but much
Mm,
higher than the US. And there are some particular goods on which the tariffs are quite high. So there's a real trade negotiation which has to be had here. And there's some legitimacy to President Trump's wanting to have a better trade deal with India.
mm,
It's just that the use of coercive diplomacy has
yes.
proven extremely counterproductive and puts at risk, the strategic relationship, which is much more important. We have a lot to be gained by cooperation, and I guess I'm hoping we can talk a little bit of how we can get back on track.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a little pushback over there, David. We must also, when we talk about the imbalance over here with India, we must also talk about the services that US exports to India, with all the big tech companies raking in billions from the Indian economy as well. So that should be part of the conversation as well. But just turning over here, how, in this conversation, while I was researching various oil companies over here, the data for it, I noticed that Turkey continues to import a large amount of oil. In fact, just for the Kepler reported, just for the month of just for 2025, 88% of Turkey's coal imports were from Russia, powering their sort of energy needs. So, how has Turkey escaped President Trump's tariff debt?
Right. And Hungary and Slovenia too, for that matter,
Right.
continue to import Russian oil because it's hard for them to access other sources. There's not a lot to be gained, so he hasn't set his sights on Turkey yet.
Mm,
Um, and I think you didn't mention it, but you can certainly point out that separate from the oil brief, Europe continues to import Russian gas, although it's working at phasing it out, and the
mm,
U.S. continues to import Russian uranium, although it hopes to substitute it, but it can't right now, and that's really the issue: is how quickly can this be done, and is this really a serious tool for bringing Russia to stop its
mm,
attack on Ukraine. I would say also I agree with you on the services. This is what's baffling to most economists is they look at the trade relationship in aggregate, goods and services, and we have a services surplus.
mm.
And looking only at goods is very, David Ricardo, 19th century, and doesn't make a lot of sense. So I'm
Myopic.
not defending it, but I'm saying, but this really is the president's perspective. He doesn't seem to care about the service balance. He cares more about the trade imbalance, as if American youth wants to go back to working in assembly lines in factories, which I don't think is the case. I mean, it's going to be a tough recruit. So I can't really I'm not justifying his approach to it, but I'm just trying to explain to your audience, it is the way he views the world. And that's why he has the priorities that he does.
I'm glad you brought up EU. EU sort of has announced that they will get off their dependence on Russian energy, but they've given a timeline of a couple of years over here. But on the flip side, India is supposed to quit cold turkey. I mean, India was squeezed in March as well to reduce its Venezuelan imports, and now with Russian imports for August of this year. So, how do you see India's position right now, juxtaposing both those examples in front of you?
Well, I think the big question for for those of us who care about the war in Ukraine and Russia's invasion, there's no question it was an illegal invasion. That pressure needs to be brought onto Russia, and if the U.S. was serious and the Europeans were serious about banning everyone's imports of Russian crude oil or gas for that matter, It might be a serious weapon, but probably not enough to end the war. It's going to be won on the ground. It's going to be done by military means. But you look at all the tools that President Trump has available to him to put pressure on Russia, and he's using none of them. He hasn't imposed any new sanctions on Russia. He's imposing sanctions on India and
Yeah.
on the European Union. He's imposing it on the allies. So I think from India's position, it's looking at this and saying, this is really not about Russia. This is really just bullying for trade. And we can't allow ourselves to enter into negotiation basically under coercion and under duress. Not surprising for anyone who has studied India, and frankly, not a very effective diplomatic tool anyway. Most of the time, we just have normal bilateral, multilateral trade negotiations. I think President Trump is seeing what's happening here and that it's not working. And I think that's why you saw his gesture to say that this is not personal to Prime Minister Modi, and then Prime Minister Modi's very helpful response, which is helping to de-escalate tensions. And this is really what needs to happen now is a serious conversation needs to happen about trade, but it needs to be in the context of the strategic relationship the United States has and can have with India. And that is a lot about capital investment in India as well as in the US. It's about defense, where India could have access to much more effective defense weapons than it has been able to obtain so far. About AI and technology, where our compatibilities are tremendous. So there's a lot to be gained here, and I'm hoping that President Trump is finding a way to back away from some of this escalation that he's undertaken, and India, I think, is right to to kind of continue to exercise its sovereignty while hopefully at the same time negotiating seriously on issues like trade, where serious negotiation needs to take place.
We saw the beginnings of an off ramp. I would be very careful to choose my words over here with that tweet exchange that we saw with Prime Minister Modi, and before that, President Trump's remarks. But then yesterday, I also saw remarks where President Trump almost it seemed frustrated, and he said that he's thinking of moving on to phase 2 of sanctions against Russia. Why don't you speculate what that would mean?
Well, the big question we have here in the United States, especially those of us who care about putting real pressure on Russia to end the war in Ukraine, is the president serious or not? It is very hard at this point to believe that he is serious about phase 2 sanctions when he's not exercising sanctions on new Russian ships, not exercising sanctions on banks, not pressuring China to end its purchases, not using any of the many tools he has available to him right now, and rolling out the red carpet for President Putin in Anchorage. So it's hard to believe that he's serious. And then his additional remarks seem to be pressuring Europe to phase out its imports of gas faster than it already is in order to buy more U.S. LNG, which is really being read here in the United States as another way of saying, I don't have any intention of putting direct pressure on Russia. I'm going to continue to put pressure on our allies to put pressure on Russia. The military brief is another one. If you really wanted to help Ukraine balance the forces, you would be arming Ukraine in order to force Russia into a serious negotiation, especially while they're at the highest level of drone attacks, cruise missile attacks, and other things going on right now. But he's not exercising any of those options. So phase 2 sanctions for President Trump seem to be imposing more sanctions on our allies, not necessarily on Russia. Now, does this mean that he will be serious with China and with Europe about importing Russian oil? I don't believe so. And so I think it's I think it's important to frame the question in the right perspective. Would it be a good idea if you wanted to bring Russia to heel? Very potentially it might be. There are other tools might be more effective. Is this what this is all about? Is this really about Russia? Is
Yeah.
this really about bringing its economy? And it's very hard to believe that this is serious, given his lack of action with all the other tools he has available to him.
How much of this is personality politics then? if you're saying that, you can see the hypocrisy in the imposition of tariffs everywhere. I mean, India is also the largest supplier of diesel to Ukraine. Just last month, that data came out as well. So, how important is personality politics over here? We know that India forcefully, denied reports that President Trump played a so-called mediating role between India-Pakistan ceasefire. Um, so you have Erdogan on one side, which they have Trump has a very good relationship with them, and Turkey doesn't get the tariffs that it should technically get for the import of Russian crude, while India, uh, PM Modi and Trump, their personality politics, where does it stand?
Well, personality politics plays a role, but this is more about the president's transactional approach to to everything, really. Personality played a role in that. I think the way this came unwound back in August is that the president had set one of his many deadlines, August 1st, for when he wanted all these trade deals done. Wasn't a realistic deadline.
Mm,
India's trade offer came in, and the US was disappointed in that.
mm,
And so it was going to push back. Initially, it was going to push back with, with higher tariffs. And then the president tried to take credit for the de-escalation of tensions with Pakistan, and India was not willing to give the president credit for something that he did not do, and Pakistan was, plus
mm,
nominating him for the Nobel. So ego did enter the equation. The president was piqued, and so he retaliated impulsively and more harshly. That said, and so yes, personality politics played a role because when his ego is offended, he lashes out. But even when those tensions are de-escalated, it's not clear whether the tariff is coming off or not.
mm,
And this is where it's really the president's transactional approach to each country. What's the best I'm going to get? What leverage do I have? Can I push this agenda and then win more than I might otherwise? And his willingness to sacrifice everything else that goes along with that relationship to get the short-term gain. And this is what is maddening, I think, to both Republicans and Democrats, who are not part of the MAGA movement, is it fundamentally misunderstands the nature of American power and of
mm,
American influence, which had more to do with building coalitions, having an open economy, not attacking your neighbors, and finding ways to lift them up so that you can tackle larger problems. The president has been willing to potentially burn decades of trust building with India
yeah.
and this strategic relationship, which is the cornerstone of a U.S. strategy to build alternate supply chains in defense and in goods and in manufacturing to contain China. You don't have an effective China strategy unless India is at least partially on side, maintaining its traditional non-aligned posture, but significantly on side. And the president thinks that he can basically say these things, let his advisors, utter these, defamatory, racist sort of epithets. But then when a deal's done, everything's going to be fine. And we're just going to go back to the way things were before. And that may be how real estate barons work, but it's not necessarily how countries work. Because when you erode trust, it's hard to build it back. So it's this transactional approach more than personality, which I think guides everything that he does in every deal. And what is so, I think, for those of us who are observing it, so short sighted.
Mm,
Even the deals themselves don't seem to hold. He's already threatening the European Union with having that deal become undone because changes in regulatory policy he wasn't able to obtain, haven't been met to his satisfaction. And now he's thrown more on phasing out gas earlier. He said, you're putting the trade deal at risk. So these deals aren't really very stable. And so that erosion is really destructive. But the president is a transactional guy, and he
right.
believes he'll just get a deal, and if that doesn't work, he'll get another one. I think he's in for a rude awakening.
What do you make of the credentials of the people advising Trump on this? You talked about some of his, the Chinese diplomacy during COVID had something called wolf warrior diplomats. What do you make of people like Peter Navarro, who pretty much come on television every day and just start spewing venom against India?
No, Peter Navarro is an insult to Wolf Warrior diplomats. There have been many Wolf Warrior diplomats, I've known in my time or seen in action, like Richard Holbrooke. He was a Wolf Warrior diplomat, but he was on a cause, pursuing interests, and incredibly effective. Navarro is a fringe economist who is a senior advisor, not even a holder of a cabinet position, who is being allowed to mouth off on things far beyond his brief. So even in the trade hierarchy, you have the Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick. You have Jameson Greer, who's the U.S. Trade Representative. You have Scott Bessent, Secretary of the Treasury, who is really leading these negotiations. Navarro is fourth, if that, but he's going on CNN, which is just a lack of message discipline. But he is an unserious person and ill-informed. And if the president's taking his advice, then he is ill-served. But I think he's being allowed to go on television and say these things as part of a public relations bullying campaign.
Okay.
I think we will know that negotiations are serious and that we're on the de-escalation path when we stop seeing Peter Navarro on TV.
Okay. And you talked about Republicans and Democrats in Washington, D.C. When these tariffs were announced against India in early August, and then when they were finally implemented in August 27th, we didn't see a lot of voices of support for India or criticism for the tariffs on both sides of the aisle. So was there sort of a bipartisanship sort of nod that Trump's strategy towards India and those importing oil, Russian oil, was right, or has there now been a bit of a change?
Let's separate those. First, the reaction to the tariffs.
Yeah.
So the business reaction to the tariffs, the citizen reaction to the tariffs has been and remains quite negative. And President Trump is at the lowest popularity rating that he has been at even in his first term. And the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has come out against these tariffs, and now that they're starting to bite, there's anger, in anyone who's on the border with Canada, anyone who deals in the agricultural sector. So you're not hearing much from that. You're hearing on tariffs generally opposition from Democrats, but not all Democrats, because a lot of our union population welcomes that kind of protectionism, so they believe that it will help their interests. But you're not hearing from Republicans, even Republicans who oppose these tariffs, essentially because of political fear. So the president has been very effective in leading this MAGA coalition, this really extreme kind of isolationist, protectionist, right-wing coalition, which is basically the opposite of what the Republican Party has stood for in the United States for decades, party of free trade and internationalism. For a couple of reasons. One is people who oppose the president tend to have an opponent financed in the primary and be run out of office. So you have that political fear. Second, you have money. Essentially, the president will back those who support him. So that's really a powerful tool as well. And the third piece of this is the trade-off. And this is where, for a lot of industry, they thought that this massive tax cut and deregulation would be more economically advantageous to them than the pain that they would suffer from tariffs. And we will see whether that is true or not. The president got what he wanted in his big, beautiful bill. It's a massive tax cut with a huge potential deficit impact on the United States. But he's raising a lot of money from tariffs, which Americans don't quite realize yet is a tax on them, not a tax on the other party. And the deregulatory approach, he is taking a wrecking ball to regulation and to independent regulators. And I think the business industry is waiting to see how that affects them. If this all comes to disaster in the fourth quarter and the first quarter of next year, and we start to see unemployment rise, as is in the case, inflation in a lot of areas, lack of investment because of this volatility, and earnings start to fall, and the stock market crashes, that'll get the president's attention and businesses' attention. But right now, there's both a climate of fear and intimidation and self-interest, which is leading the Republican Party, at least, to be quite silent on these tariffs.
Right. And now, how would you advise trade teams across the world now dealing with America? You see, this challenge has now, well, the tariff issue is now going to be in the Supreme Court. David, what happens if the Supreme Court sides with the judge over there calling the tariffs unlawful? President Trump loses leverage then during negotiations.
He loses some leverage. I think it's actually likely the Supreme Court will find that they call IEPA, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, does not provide the power for the president to designate tariffs against countries. But there are many other tariffs tools, Section 301, Section 232, and the court cases so far have said that the justification he has provided is not sufficient under IEPA, but it's possible they will come up with another justification. So the imposition might be slower, but will still be coming. So I would encourage negotiating teams to continue to negotiate. I mean, there are real trade issues here, and I think the president is seeking more market access. I think countries need to think about opening their markets, more. And in exchange for that, there will be a lower tariff. So I think negotiating in a serious fashion is important, and I would think that's important for India too. But I would say for some countries, particularly like India, but for others, it's probably important to elevate the conversation to the strategic level,
Yes.
which is not only the cabinet level, but also the entire context of the relationship. So that to really, I think, to push back against this transactional nature.
Mm.
Certainly, my recommendation with my colleague, Ambassador Jeff Pyatt, who served many years in India, was that we really elevate this conversation into a strategic, economic, energy, and trade dialogue, because the role that India plays in U.S. policy towards Venezuela and Iran and security and China is an important context to remember when you're talking about how hard you're going to bargain on trade. And by elevating that conversation and perhaps bringing a CEO dialogue back, reviving that so that business can talk to business about what that potential is, I think we can leaven the dialogue a little bit and make it a little contextualize it in a way that will be more effective. So I'd say for those countries that have a potential strategic relationship with the United States like that, elevating and broadening the dialogue would be a constructive tool.
David, you're talking a lot like an official from the Biden administration, because during Jake Sullivan's tenure and the Biden administration, the relationship between India and America had really reached a peak in a way, and this was a continuation of almost 20-25 years of sort of bipartisan approval in America for the India relationship. Now, that keeping in mind, Biden had told India that, at that time when the Russia-Ukraine war started, that India keep importing Russian crude just to stabilize oil prices. And now you're seeing a drastic 180 shift. How does New Delhi trust Washington, D.C. now as a stable ally?
Well, I think it's you make two important points there. I want to take up the first. You're absolutely right. It was the policy of the Biden administration, but it actually remains the policy of the European Union to try and contain Russia by having a price cap, which
Yes.
means that you can't use Western insurers and shippers unless you have a lower price, which reduces revenues to Russia. And we did that because, or the Biden administration did that at the time, because removing 5 million barrels a day of Russian crude from the global markets would likely increase prices somewhere between, $7 to $8 per million barrels or something like that. You're talking about, $35, $45 a barrel. Nobody wanted that. They still don't want that. Europe just lowered the price cap 2 weeks ago. So it remains the policy. And India was, yes, encouraged to buy oil and did provide a highly stabilizing influence. And today, were we to remove those 5 million barrels a day by having India and China and Turkey and others not buy it, you'd have the same $35 to $40 a barrel impact. I just don't believe President Trump is serious about that. So, that was India had been asked to do that, and so India has complied with U.S. sanctions, not to mention its compliance on Iran and on Venezuela as well. The fact that it is paying a higher price for those right now does not mean it's not in compliance with
Mm,
sanctions. So it's really a misreading by the media to say that India is out of compliance, and it was stabilizing. And I think the profiteering allegation is false as well. I think there hasn't been really a significant difference in the profitability of India's companies before and after importing Russian oil. So I think that, on that front, I think that's that's absolutely the case. Can countries trust America's word? It's really hard right now. I mean, I have to say, the you cited the Biden administration's commitments to India, but Bush administration, Bush 43, really began the rapprochement. So it's been bipartisan. But the president changes his mind a lot.
mm,
And it is hard for Americans, to hear what the president says and know whether it's true. Many deadlines have been set and many deadlines have passed. There's even on Wall Street, they coined the term taco, which is Trump always chickens
check it
out.
out. Yeah.
Because they essentially, there wasn't a market reaction to a lot of the potential negative economic news because the market essentially didn't believe that the president would follow through with it. Now, when he
Mm,
does start following through with it, the market is going to react and will react negatively. So I think it's very challenging. And this is going to be an iterative process. There will be
yeah.
agreements, but there is leverage on both sides. If the president wants, Indian companies to buy U.S. energy, then, and that's the quid pro quo for an exchange, then India has leverage too in that economic relationship.
Mm.
That was the theory of interdependence. Is the more interdependent we are, the less likely we are to attack each other, and punish each other because it's important to maintain the relationship. And I think that may provide more of a natural balance in the relationship
Mm.
than politics would otherwise provide. And so that's why I'd like to see a CEO to CEO dialogue. I'd like to see this elevated to the strategic level. And I'd like to see more economic cooperation between the United States and India because we can really improve prosperity in both countries in
Mm.
many, many sectors, through those kinds of arrangements. And it disciplines the politicians a bit
Mm.
because they do listen to business because, to a large extent, especially in the American system, that's where the money comes from.
Is India being scapegoated for President Trump's reading of Vladimir Putin?
India's being scapegoated essentially over the trade arrangements, but President Trump's misreading of Vladimir Putin, I don't think India is really being scapegoated for that. It is a remarkable thing at this point that the president still believes that he could, through bonhomie, sort of persuade on day one Putin to agree to a ceasefire. We're way past day one, and Putin has proved just today and yesterday how little he thinks of the president's threats of additional sanctions or anything else. So I think India is being victimized in a sense because the president believes it's a point of leverage that he
Mm.
has over India that he doesn't really have over China.
Mm.
Um, but so I think that's a vulnerability that he is exploiting. But by standing fast, India has proven it's far less of a vulnerability than the president thought it was, and that's why hopefully, we're back to talking and talking privately rather than threatening through the press.
When when PM Modi went to Tianjin for the SCO, and you saw those visuals with PM Modi, with Putin, with Xi Jinping, and then we saw President Trump's reaction as well that India and Russia have been lost to the deepest and darkest China. It was a very loaded sort of tweet post by President Trump. What's your analysis of that?
Well, I think it was great theater at the SEO summit, but I believe that the tensions between the countries that were present at the SEO, India and China, not the least of those, make that unlikely to be a forum for any significant security or economic cooperation. But the symbolism of that, which is that India has other partners, and that China is seen as a convener and stabilizer. and that Russia is less isolated now than it was a year ago. None of those messages were lost on President Trump, which is why you got the tweet reaction that you got. You hope it would also have the impact of having his foreign policy advisors that maybe we ought to say a little less publicly and a little more privately and get this relationship back on track. I think it was taken as symbolism, but it was important symbolism, and I think it was definitely not unnoticed. But
Yes.
as with anything, I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock in what you see in a tweet as being predictive of policy. Um, this is the art of the deal for President Trump, and I hope will be a deal, a trade deal, and others with India, and we will get back to, a more normalized relationship. But it will be one which has significantly less trust than
Yes.
it did 6 months ago.
How linked are a potential trade deal with India and an end to the Russia-Ukraine war? Can they both of them be separate?
It's a good question, and it's really uncertain. I think the president added the 25% tariff and imposed it just on India as a negotiating tool. But it does not necessarily mean that a trade deal will be had without having some visibility on the future of what trade will be with Russia when it comes to oil. And if the president isn't imposing these consequences on anyone else, then different outcomes are possible. I certainly think that as a good faith gesture in this de-escalation of tensions, the president ought to remove that 25% tariff imposed on India, let the negotiations continue without coercion, and then perhaps talk about what a policy on Russia might be. Singling out India, I think, is not viable. But this comes back to the question we talked about before, which is how serious is President Trump about putting pressure on Russia to end the war versus putting pressure on Europe and India and other countries
Yeah.
to change their behavior in the hopes that that will end the war. It's hard to believe that he is serious, but time will tell. If we get to the point where he is serious about, and the Europeans are serious about secondary sanctions rather than secondary tariffs, and if they're willing to impose them on all countries, then we'll be in a different world, and trade flows will shift in a different way. But we're not seeing that yet, and I think if the president hopes that U.S. oil is going to substitute for Russian oil, he's going to need a little counseling on crude quality and heaviness and what kind of refiner, what kind of oil India refines. But it's a really good question, and I don't think any of us know the answer to that.
And I just want to end this by you talking a little bit about the China relationship, because China is the largest importer of Russia, and you have answered some questions in this interview about that. But so the fact that China has escaped all these tariffs and sanctions, when Trump talks about the second stage or second phase of sanctions against Russia in this war, do you foresee Trump slapping China with secondary sanctions or tariffs, extra tariffs?
I don't see him moving to secondary sanctions or imposing these on China until he gets through the next round of trade talks.
Okay.
And I think the future of those sanctions will be on the table in those talks. At some point, if he gets stiffed and he thinks that this will be an effective measure, then he will impose additional sanctions. But with China, he's not going to stop their tankers. He's not going to be able to interrupt flows by pipeline. And his tools are going to be more to sanction Russian vessels and to punish Chinese ports. And the sanctions on Chinese ports have so far proved to be the tool which best gets the attention of the Chinese government, because that impacts not just crude, but China's ability to trade in almost any goods. If no good coming out of a Chinese port can come to the US market, much more is at risk than energy. And so this is what the negotiation is really about. The US has better tools to pressure China than using the oil weapon, and it hasn't used them yet because talks are ongoing. So that really remains to be seen. But I don't think you're going to see any effective sanctions against China until they're through the next round of trade talks. And everything that we have seen so far on the Russia brief has been more pressure on the European Union, not more
Right.
pressure on Russia.
Do you think Xi Jinping will play ball? I mean, they do have the Communist Party does have its plenum scheduled for next month, and which would potentially clarify Xi Jinping's hold over China. I think till then, do you think Xi Jinping will just hold out before any trade deal is finalized?
I think there's a deal to be had.
Hmm.
And I think trade talks will be effective because the Chinese economy is in some trouble. Growth is a serious issue, and they need to be able to export, and they need to have access to technology. And so um, I don't think Xi Jinping can just hold out, just say no indefinitely without facing some severe penalties. And so they have more cards, as the president likes to say, than maybe others have, but they don't have the strongest hand. And so this is going to be a real test of the efficacy of the Trump team. Is what are they going to put on the table? What are they willing to give? And what role does energy play in this? But I don't see any significant sanctions enforcement on Russia. And really, the next geopolitical shoe to drop here is going to be on Iran, uh,
Mhm.
with the snapback of sanctions likely to come in September. And so they will be seeking China's cooperation on Iran as well. So, the question for the Chinese will be, do they just hold steady with the level of imports that they have and not take any more? They may have pretty much all the crude that they need and make that their concession. And it raises the question for India as well, whether, as we have seen before on the Iran brief, whether some sort of eventual phase down or substitution or material reductions over time, which may make commercial sense anyway in a world of lower prices, whether that's going to be an acceptable out. So I think there are off ramps here, for the conflict with India, and there are off ramps for China, and I think modulating energy could be one of them. Um, but that's if we're using the rational actor model and hoping that diplomats make sensible decisions, and that remains to be seen.
All right. On that note, thank you for talking to us, David.
My great pleasure.